The moment my mother said, "Rachel deserves half your lake house," the entire patio went silent. I looked around the table, waiting for someone to laugh. No one did. My younger sister leaned back in her chair with a satisfied smile, as if the conversation had already been settled before I arrived. The only sounds were the waves brushing against the dock and the soft clink of silverware that suddenly felt much louder than before. "I'm sorry," I said calmly. "Did I hear that correctly?" My mother folded her hands as though she were delivering perfectly reasonable news. "You heard me. You paid for the place, but Rachel needs security. Family shares what it has." I stared at her, trying to understand how a celebration had turned into a negotiation over something I had spent 15 years working toward. This wasn't a vacation cabin my parents had handed down. It wasn't an inheritance. It wasn't a family investment. That lake house was mine. Every mortgage payment, every renovation, every tax bill, every sleepless night building my interior design business so I could finally afford it. All of it had come from me. Rachel cleared her throat. "It isn't like we're asking for all of it," she said. "Just half. You'd barely notice." Barely notice. I almost laughed. Half of a $900,000 property was somehow supposed to be a casual favor. Kevin, my brother-in-law, nodded in agreement. It would stay in the family. I looked at him. "It already is." He frowned. "You know what I mean." Actually, I did. What he meant was that they wanted the benefits of ownership without making any of the sacrifices that came with earning it. My mother leaned forward. "You've always been the successful one. Rachel has struggled." There it was. The same excuse I'd heard my entire life. Rachel struggled. Therefore I paid. Rachel made bad decisions. Therefore I sacrificed. Rachel wanted something. Therefore I was expected to provide it. For years it had been small things. Loans that were never repaid. Vacations I was pressured to fund. Bills that somehow became my responsibility. Birthday gifts that mysteriously came from mom and dad, even though I'd secretly paid for them. Every time I objected, I heard the same sentence. "She's your sister." Now the request wasn't a few $100s. It wasn't even a few thousand. It was ownership of the one place that truly belonged to me. I took a slow sip of my iced tea before answering. "If Rachel wants half of this lake house," I said evenly, "she's welcome to buy half at market value." Rachel's smile disappeared instantly. "What?" "You heard me." My mother slammed her hand against the table hard enough to rattle the glasses. "So money matters more than your own family?" I met her eyes without raising my voice. "No." I paused just long enough for everyone to hear the next sentence. "But respecting my hard work does." The silence that followed felt heavier than the summer heat. Then Rachel stood up so quickly her chair scraped across the wooden deck. "I knew you'd show your true colors someday." One by one, my relatives began agreeing with her. Selfish, greedy, heartless. Not a single person asked how I'd managed to buy the house. Not one congratulated me for years of sacrifice. In less than 5 minutes, I had gone from proud homeowner to family villain. I left the table before the shouting could get any worse. As I walked toward the dock, I heard my mother say something that stopped me in my tracks. "If she won't give it to you willingly," she whispered to Rachel, believing I was already out of earshot, "we'll find another way." I wish I could tell you she didn't mean it. I wish I could tell you it was just anger talking. 3 weeks later, I discovered they had already started trying. Looking back, that conversation on the patio wasn't where the story began. It was simply the first time my family's favoritism became impossible to ignore. Growing up, Rachel had always been the golden child. If she forgot to do her homework, my mother blamed the teacher. If she quit another job after a few weeks, it was because her boss didn't appreciate her. If she overspent her paycheck, someone else was expected to rescue her. Usually, that someone was me. I was 3 years older, and from the time I was a teenager, I learned that being responsible came with an invisible price tag. Good grades meant I could tutor Rachel. A part-time job meant I could lend her money. A promotion meant I could help with another one of her emergencies. Whenever I questioned it, my mother repeated the same line. "You're stronger than your sister. Families help the ones who need it most." At first, I believed her. I convinced myself that being dependable was simply part of loving my family. But over the years, I started noticing something strange. The help only flowed in one direction. When my old car broke down during my 20s, Rachel didn't offer to drive me to work. When I worked 70-hour weeks trying to grow my interior design business, nobody called to ask if I was sleeping enough. When I skipped vacations because every extra dollar went towards saving for a home, my parents told relatives I was too busy for family. No one mentioned that I was sacrificing weekends, holidays, and countless late nights to build a future for myself. Meanwhile, Rachel and her husband, Kevin, lived well beyond their means. They leased expensive vehicles they couldn't comfortably afford, upgraded phones every year, and took vacations that somehow fit into a budget that never seemed to cover their bills. Whenever the credit card balances caught up with them, my mother would sigh dramatically and say, "They're just going through a difficult season." Then she'd look at me. I didn't even need to hear the request anymore. I could see it coming. Sometimes it was helping with rent. Other times it was paying for home repairs, covering holiday expenses, or temporarily lending money that was never mentioned again. If I agreed, I was praised as the wonderful daughter. If I hesitated, I was accused of letting success change me. It took years to realize the rules were different for Rachel and me. Her mistakes were everyone's problem to solve. My achievements were everyone's property to divide. By the time I finally bought my lake house, I thought I had earned one thing that belonged only to me. I was wrong. To my family, the deed might have carried only my name, but in their minds, everything I owned had always been available for the taking. I just didn't realize how far they were willing to go until they decided that asking wasn't enough anymore. After the family barbecue, my phone became impossible to ignore. Every morning started the same way. A dozen missed calls. Long text messages telling me I was tearing the family apart. Voicemails reminding me that money isn't everything. Not one person asked how I was doing. Not one person asked why I said no. They only wanted me to change my answer. So I stopped responding. The silence hurt more than I expected. For the first time in years, I realized most of my relationships had been built on what I could provide, not who I was. I spent several weekends alone at the lake house. At first, the quiet felt heavy. Every room reminded me of the people I thought would celebrate my success. Instead, they had turned it into something they believed they deserved. One rainy afternoon, while organizing old storage boxes in the basement, I found a folder filled with receipts from years ago. There were invoices for night classes I'd taken after working full-time. Bank statements showing automatic transfers into my savings account. Receipts for used furniture because buying new wasn't an option back then. Looking through those papers brought back memories I hadn't thought about in years. I remembered living in a tiny one-bedroom apartment with peeling paint and a heater that barely worked during the winter. I remembered eating simple meals for weeks so I could keep adding to my savings. I remembered working weekdays at my design firm, taking freelance projects at night, and spending weekends studying business and real estate because I wanted a better future. There were birthdays I missed, vacations I declined, countless evenings when I fell asleep with my laptop still open beside me. No one saw those years. They only saw the finished lake house. Standing there with those old receipts in my hands, something inside me shifted. The guilt I'd carried for disappointing my family slowly gave way to something stronger. Perspective. This home wasn't luck. It wasn't a gift. It was the result of thousands of quiet choices that no one had applauded. If I had been willing to sacrifice that much to build my future, I wasn't about to give it away simply because someone else believed they were entitled to it. I didn't know what my family was planning next, but I knew one thing with absolute certainty. I had worked far too hard to let anyone rewrite the story of how I got here. About 3 weeks after the barbecue, the pressure suddenly stopped. No phone calls, no angry texts, no relatives telling me to do the right thing. The silence should have felt like a victory. Instead, it made me suspicious. My family had never given up that easily. Then, on a Tuesday morning, my attorney called. "Emma," he said, "I think you should come to my office today. There's something you need to see." His tone was calm, but serious enough that I canceled my afternoon appointments. When I arrived, he slid a folder across the desk. "Have you authorized anyone to discuss transferring an ownership interest in your lake house?" My stomach dropped. "No." He nodded. "I didn't think so." He explained that someone had recently contacted professionals asking general questions about changing ownership and preparing transfer documents related to residential property. Nothing had been filed, and no ownership had changed, but the inquiries were unusual enough that he wanted to verify everything with me before anyone acted on misleading information. Then he handed me copies of paperwork someone had asked about. At first glance, the documents looked harmless. Routine forms. Standard language. The kind of paperwork most people would skim before signing. But buried several pages in was wording that could create a partial ownership transfer if properly completed and signed. I felt my hands go cold. This can't be a coincidence, I whispered. I agree, my attorney replied. Which is why I'm advising you not to sign anything related to your property without legal review. 2 days later, my mother called for the first time since our argument. Her voice sounded unusually warm. Honey, I think it's time we put all this behind us. No apology. No acknowledgement of what had happened. Just an invitation. We're having a family dinner on Saturday. Rachel wants to make peace. Less than an hour later, Rachel texted me. Let's stop fighting. We have some paperwork that'll make future family visits easier. Nothing complicated. Just come. Red heart ***. Reading that message, I remembered the documents sitting on my attorney's desk. The timing wasn't just suspicious. It was almost identical. For the first time in my life, I wasn't hoping the family dinner would repair our relationship. I was wondering what they expected me to sign. And this time, I planned to read every single page before saying a word. Saturday evening, I drove to my parents' house with my attorney's advice echoing in my mind. Read everything. Sign nothing. Stay calm. ***. The moment I walked inside, everyone acted as if the last 3 weeks had never happened. My mother hugged me. Rachel smiled. Kevin even offered to pour me a drink. It was almost convincing. Dinner was unusually pleasant. They complimented my business, asked about the Lakehouse, and laughed at old family stories. Anyone walking past the dining room would have assumed we were the perfect family. Then, just as dessert was served, Rachel reached into her handbag and placed a neat folder in front of me. There it is, she said cheerfully. Just a few routine documents. It'll make everything easier for the family. My mother nodded. We've already looked them over. It's nothing complicated. I smiled politely. I'm sure. Instead of opening the folder immediately, I took my time finishing my coffee. The room grew noticeably quieter. Finally, I opened the first page. Most of it looked ordinary. Addresses, names, property descriptions. Nothing alarming. Then I reached the section my attorney had warned me about. There it was. A clause stating that, upon execution, Rachel would receive a 50% ownership interest in the Lakehouse, hidden among paragraphs of ordinary legal language. Exactly as my attorney had predicted, I slowly closed the folder. So, I said calmly, which one of you thought I wouldn't read this? Rachel's face lost its color. Kevin looked toward my mother. No one answered. Instead, my mother forced a nervous laugh. Oh, that's just legal wording. It doesn't mean what you think. I slid the folder back across the table. It means exactly what it says. The room fell silent. Then I reached into my bag and placed another folder beside theirs. My attorney reviewed these documents before I came. For the first time all evening, no one smiled. I continued. He also documented the earlier inquiries about transferring an ownership interest in my property. Rachel's eyes widened. Kevin looked down at the table. My mother whispered, Emma. I raised a hand. I'm not finished. I explained that I would not be signing anything and that all future communication regarding my property would go directly through my attorney. I also made it clear that any further attempts to pressure me or misrepresent ownership would be documented and handled through the appropriate legal channels. No shouting. No insults. Just facts. The confidence disappeared from their faces almost instantly. The people who had spent weeks calling me selfish suddenly had nothing to say. As I stood to leave, my mother quietly asked, So that's it? I looked around the room one last time. No, I replied. This is simply where my boundaries finally begin. I walked out carrying both my dignity and the Lakehouse I'd worked years to earn, leaving behind the first family dinner where silence spoke louder than manipulation ever could. The weeks that followed were quieter than I could ever remember. After my attorney sent formal notices requesting that all matters related to my property be handled through legal counsel, the constant calls and messages finally stopped. A few relatives who had eagerly taken my mother's side began reaching out. Not to accuse me this time. To apologize. Several admitted they had only heard one version of the story. They never imagined I had been asked to sign documents that could affect ownership of the Lakehouse. While I appreciated their honesty, I had learned that trust is much harder to rebuild than it is to lose. My mother called several times over the next few months. Her messages sounded different now. Less demanding. more uncertain. I just want us to be a family again. Rachel sent a short text saying she wished things had turned out differently. For the first time in years, neither of them asked me for money, favors, or property. I hoped they would find a better path, but I also understood that forgiveness doesn't require returning to the same unhealthy patterns. Instead of reopening old wounds, I focused on building a life filled with people who respected boundaries as much as they valued relationships. The Lakehouse became my sanctuary. Early mornings were spent on the dock with a cup of coffee, watching the sunrise reflect across the water. Evenings were filled with friends who came because they enjoyed my company, not because they wanted something from me. The house no longer reminded me of betrayal. It reminded me of resilience. Sometimes I thought about my grandfather's favorite advice. Asterisk, the things you earn have value. The peace you protect is priceless. Asterisk, back then, I thought he was talking about money. Now I know he was talking about self-respect. Losing the approval of people who measured love by what they could take from me felt painful at first. But keeping my integrity was worth far more than keeping the peace. My family believed owning part of my lake house would make them happier. They were wrong. What truly changed my life wasn't protecting the property. It was protecting the person who worked so hard to earn it. And every time I unlocked the front door, looked out across the calm water, and felt the quiet settle around me, I was reminded that the greatest home I had ever built wasn't made of wood and stone. It was the life I finally chose for myself.